think Joel's ready. I'm the support act. And as the support act, I don't get a proper PA. He gets to carry around version. It's audience participation night. You didn't think you'd have to do something, but you are. Who went to the RIBA lecture about a year ago? Nobody. That's good. 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. They can go. And presumably very few people went to the talk he did here 4 years ago. No one. 1, 2, 3. Good. Same people. It's like a Rolling Stones show. It's always the same crowd. All right. Well, since a year ago, Mr. Fisher has done 200 buildings, being a man who believes in quantity and quality, whereas someone of our more famous architects do about 100 in a lifetime. I remember John Lautner was very keen that he'd done 300 schemes in his life, his 50-year career. So there's something different happening here. And rather like all good acts, I should probably introduce it in traditional fashion. After all, Mick Jagger's been doing the same act for 20 years, 30 years, so I might as well. Last time I did it in the persona of James Brown's warm-up act, a small man who would bring on the capes, and that's my role tonight. And for 20 or 30 years, he's always done the same thing. And he always says, so now, ladies and gentlemen, it is star time. Are you ready for star time? Yes. Thank you, and thank you very kindly. It is indeed a great pleasure to present to you at this particular time, national and international known as the hardest working man in show business, the man that sings, I Go Crazy. You'll get it. Bewildered. $1 million seller, Think. The very latest release, Please Don't Go. Everybody shout and shimmy, Mr. Dynamite, the amazing Mr. Please, Please, Please himself, the star of the show, Mr. Mark Fisher and his famous Flames.
Thank you so very much. I should perhaps begin by saying that the reason I design rock shows is to avoid having to perform. But anyway, that is, as a lot of you know, what I'm going to talk about tonight. Where to begin on this thing? As Andrew says quite correctly, this is in fact a rerun of a lecture I gave a year ago at the RIBA. Now, to me, this is rather odd because in my business, all of us who work in it produce stage sets, constructions, and so forth at the most prolific rate. So it seems a bit of a shock to me to not have done a major outdoor show in the past 12 months. But of course, in the past 12 months, the Rolling Stones set has been put up about 100 times around the world. So at one level, the thing has been going on without me. And when I gave the lecture in the RIBA about a year ago, the thing had not in fact been done in the UK at all, and since then it's been through the UK, and as some of you may have read in the popular press, was recently abandoned because they declared it was too unprofitable to continue. I thought this would be a good place to start the discussion of rock and roll shows tonight, because the Rolling Stones set, and this applies to all 4 of the sets that I'm going to talk to you about tonight, cost about $1.3 million a week to keep on the road, which sounds like a lot of money until you think how much money you make by selling 55,000 tickets a night at $35 a head, which for those of you who are slow on the arithmetic is about $2 million a night. So if you struggle through manfully and manage to flog 210,000 seats in Wembley Stadium over 3 nights, you can see that 1.3 million leaves a little bit for the band to take home at the end. So it was slightly crying wolf for them to declare that they were giving up because they weren't making any money. What they really meant to say was that they weren't making as much money as they'd become used to, which is perhaps where we should begin, since this entire lecture is about making money. And here we should go. So I start by defining the territory, which is show business, which I've always regarded architecture as being a branch of. And the thing that makes the show business of real shows different to that carefully crafted three-dimensional processional space stuff, which other people call architecture, is really the business of locking the audience into a fixed relationship with the building. And these two 19th century photographs, I think, exemplify what I think is interesting about the potential of constructing artifacts or armatures to do shows from, the idea of building a ramp entirely for the purpose of leaping off it on a horse into a tank of water, or constructing a ramp entirely for the purpose of jumping over the River Seine on a bicycle. These sorts of things are what I'm going to talk about. And I have a sort of dim architectural pedigree to bring to this sort of thing, in that I look at the world of temporary architecture mostly and covet things from the past and remember them. And this slide on the left from 1937, which is the all agricultural union tractor display outside the Bolshoi Theatre, is a very fine sort of indicator of the values that I'd like to get into the rock and roll work that I do, because it's a sort of narrative structure. It's something that if somebody says, as Eisner, the head of Disney, is prone to say, give me 3 words on what it is. You say, well, it's a big tractor in a square in front of the Bolshoi Theatre. And he says, okay, it's tractor factory, tractors. And in the same way, the 1939 exhibition in New York, this is tomorrow, had in the Trilon and Perisphere the same kind of iconic, simple, popular architecture created in just taking platonic shapes and turning them into huge buildings, as those of you who've seen the real photographs of the exhibition will recall. And so simple, so obvious, and so perfectly popular, which is what all of this is really trying to do. The origins of the rock and roll end of entertainment, as much as they have any pedigree at all, arise in the United States, of course, and can probably be measured from the rise of Elvis, whose own departure into doing large-scale outdoor shows. He was probably the first popular musician to really do it, was highly dependent on the invention of electrical amplification, which obviously was something that there was not much of it before the Second World War, but at the end of the Second World War, with all the technology that had been invented, it was suddenly possible to go out on tour and play in baseball stadiums and places like that. And the idea of doing that was not unfamiliar to people like Elvis's manager, because the circus industry in the United States immediately before the Second World War, by the late 30s, had become a huge traveling affair. And this Barnum and Bailey poster is very nice for just reminding us of the scale of what was being done by people in traditional entertainment before rock and roll appeared on the scene. And for those who think that rock and roll is extravagant, it's never ever got anywhere near the idea of having trains 1/3 of a mile long loaded with 1,000 wonders of the world. So I think there's quite a long way to go yet. But the part of it that I've got involved with in my life really dates from 1965, when the Beatles played in Shea Stadium. And this slide on the left is the elemental what you need to do a rock show. It is self-evidently a band and an audience. Everything else is undeniably superfluous. And so this talk this evening is entirely about what my colleagues describe what I do as, which is essentially the hairdressing of the rock show. And the slide of Woodstock, 1969, on the right, is another testament to the fact that you don't really need very much to do this kind of thing. And it actually shows, in its most elemental form, although it's not very easy to make out, the basic program for the rock and roll stage, which will be repeated through all of the 4 shows that I'm going to show you pictures of tonight. And if I have any point to make at all at a philosophical level, which I really barely dare to do, it is that I think there's some interest in the fact that you can take such a simple and undemanding 2-dimensional program and write such a variety of narrative interpretations on top of it in a hostile environment, such as the business of taking it from city to city every 3 days and still making money on it, and basically do all of that without having to pay any attention to the real business of how you travel it, because it's actually all very easy. But my own start in this thing was with Pink Floyd, because I used to make inflatables when I was a student here back in the 60s. And one day, while I was teaching here, in fact, an agent of the band, bands don't really ring you up themselves because they don't know how to use telephones, an agent of the band rang me up and asked if I still made inflatables and would I mind making some pigs for them, because they'd just lost one over Battersea Power Station. So I'd love to be able to say that this slide on the right is a picture of my own. It's actually a hypnosis slide of the real Floyd pig before it got away outside Battersea Power Station. The slide on the left, however, this is the work of a fine man called Tim Hunkin and a pyrotechnician called Will Scott, who both remain friends of mine, who invented the flying sheep. These are sheep and they are flying. They're actually on their way down, for those of you who are interested in matters of detail. My contribution to that tour, which was made, all of the work that I'm going to show you tonight, I get this over now, with the exception of one show, was done in partnership with a gentleman who used to teach here as well, an engineer by the name of Jonathan Park, who got involved with me to his detriment, I don't know, but when we both were working in teaching in diploma school, and we went off and joined the circus and built all these inflatables for the Floyd 1977 tour, and that was pretty much when we stopped teaching, because this was much more fun. The 77 tour was it turned out to be a rather surprising affair to be involved with, because the Floyd themselves were trying to break out of what had already become a kind of generic structure of presentation for rock and roll shows, and they came up with and went to Ted Happold at Bureau Happold to get these copies of Fry Otto umbrellas to bring out of the stage. And these were part of an idea that the show itself would live at the end of the stadium and not really identify its territory as being separate from the territory of the stadium itself. The conventional approach, which you'll see in some slides I'll show you in a moment, is to effectively create a proscenium theatre at the end of the stadium. And what the Floyd were doing back then even was trying to create a much more environmental experience. And certainly in the slide on the right, where you can see this 1,000-foot long pyrotechnic waterfall stretching right across the width of the stadium, this was to some extent magically achieved in these shows, and the umbrellas were there to keep the rain off, and they appeared magically through the floor of the stage and unfolded, and then provided interesting receptacles into which people up to about 20 yards away could lob beer cans. The curious byproduct of which was that they would not then fold up and go back down through the holes in the stage. But this pair of slides from 1982, which is the Rolling Stones tour of Europe from that date, shows what had, by the early 70s, become pretty much the standard proscenium form for creating a stage in an outdoor environment. This is one slide from Rotterdam from the back and one from Roundhay Park in Leeds from the front. And it shows what had really been set up as the standard way of constructing and decorating these things. And what you can see is a type of lightweight structure which I think no architect grounded in the world of lightweight structures would have contemplated as a solution to this problem. Basically, the construction engineers who were doing these shows, who tended to come from a scaffolding background, constructed flat slabs of scaffolding truss to make rigid boxes, which is the roof, basically 18 meters square, and then lifted these things up between twin towers of scaffolding into which they also placed the loudspeakers. And this is about the most crude form of lightweight weather covering structure you could possibly create, but it has a whole number of advantages from the point of view of a touring rock and roll production, the most significant of which is that you can raise and lower the roof at any time. This gives you a great deal of flexibility in the event that the wind should come up, because you can immediately reduce the apparent height of your building by lowering the roof. It also means that you can lower the roof in and attach all of your lights to it before you lift the thing up in the first place. And then, if you're feeling extravagant, as the Stones plainly were in 82, you put a bit of decoration on the front, but that's not entirely necessary. And my interest in doing these big outdoor shows has largely been a process of wringing the changes on this basic and unchanging proscenium form, in which we have a stage in the center, stereo PA placed on either side of the band, and some method of lighting them placed over the top and around the sides. This is a shot of a show that I did for Wham in, must have been about 1985, I think, which shows some way in which you can take this generic form and wring some sort of changes out of it by putting scrims on the front and lighting them. And the manner of the lighting is pretty obvious. And here, Tina Turner from 1990, I think. And again, this is exactly the same form of stage, decorated to look rather different. And what I was really doing during this time was waiting for somebody to come along who would have the kind of interest in the problem of presenting their show to broaden the conversation and get away from this very plain proscenium form. At the same time, it's true that there was never any way that the various technical functions of the rock show were going to get put to one side. So when I started talking to the Stones about the Steel Wheels tour, the conversation could be about, let's try and make the thing cyberpunk, let's read the novels of William Gibson and all of that kind of thing, and bring this kind of narrative into the design. But it's not something that at the same time is going to allow you to get away from the fact that the sound engineer wants the loudspeakers to be put in a very particular spatial relationship to the band to ensure that he doesn't get feedback down the loudspeaker, down the microphones. And so this pair of sketches, which show the basic presentation of what became the Steel Wheels show, worked within the same formula as the proscenium stages that you've seen in the earlier slides, but tried to extract some change out of it in a big way by getting rid of the roof and putting in its place a small roof in the center that barely covered the electronic equipment of the band. Is that electronics? Reverse, sorry. And hey, this is magic. Off. Does it mean the same here? Yes. Being a show, of course, it needed a bit more than just a static structure to get them through the 2 hours. And one of the proposals, which became quite a feature of the show was an early idea that in one of the songs, which turned out to be Honky Tonk Women, they should have some large inflatables to pop up and decorate the structure. The early proposal, the first proposal, was to have 2 sailors and 2 cafe waitresses, but being the Stones, they weren't too keen on the sailors, and so we ended up sticking with the ladies only, which you can see in a model that was built of the stage set on the right there. The original idea for these ladies, which explains their rather curious location when you see them in real life, is that they were going to go right up on the top of the scaffolding, sitting on it and with their legs dangling over. But rock and roll production is a team effort, and this is it uses the word team rather loosely, because teams do not always do what you want, and especially when there are more of them than you, your theoretical position in the team can be totally irrelevant. And so when the scaffolders took one look at this problem and declared that the inflatables were going to go lower down, there was not very much that I could do about it. This became the final form of the thing, and I'm going through these drawings partly to give you a chance of seeing how, even in as laid back and crazy an industry as the production of rock and roll stages, it goes through pretty much the same sort of processes that a conventional architectural design goes through, with increasingly detailed sketches, models, and lavishly wrought elevations to try and persuade the client to part with their money. But this was the final product that we took on the road, and the purpose of these 2 slides is to let you see the finished thing, and then, as is going to be the pattern for the remaining 3 shows as well, I'm going to just talk you through the key things of how an object like this comes into existence and gets erected and gets taken down. So this might be a moment to say a little bit about the touring schedule of a show like this, which gets increasingly tight as promoters become and bands become increasingly greedy. But in '89, we were basically given 2 days to build this before the band came onto the stage. And so a way of understanding it was that we would go into a stadium at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning, and the band would do a show on the Wednesday afternoon. Now, the problem with that is that it means, if you take it at face value, you can only do 2 shows a week, and so in different cities. And so the way that a show like this was toured was that the scaffolding substructure that I'll point out in a moment that lies underneath this thing, this scaffolding substructure, there were several of these structures which toured the country, leapfrogging from venue to venue. And then there were sets of scenery which were quite separate and were in fact the custom-built part of it. And these sets of scenery travelled to more of the venues. There were basically 2 sets of scenery on this show, and they leapfrogged between what in extremis became 4 sets of scaffolding in order to get the number of shows a week up to 3.5 to 4 shows a week in different cities, which is the sort of break-even point. Well, the phrase break-even is loosely used here. They're getting it up to 300 or 400% profit on your investment point of the tour. The thing that's interesting about this show is that it relied, being 1989, on this marvellously Egyptian form of construction, the completely standard rented scaffolding structure. And the reasons for that were that it allowed this whole armature to be created entirely out of rental stock, using large amounts of locally hired casual labour. And the custom-built scenery which got added to this armature of scaffolding, and here you see pieces of decorative trussing being added to it, is really, if you look at it closely, quite a small amount of the total investment of time and materials in creating any show. And the total capital investment probably on this show in custom-built scenery was about $2 million, which may seem like a lot of money to get to spend on a pile of totally superfluous rubbish, but it's a very small amount if you actually amortize it over the 100 and odd shows that the tour did in the course of 30 weeks, playing to 55,000 people a night at whatever it was a head. In those days, probably about $25 or $30. These shots just give you an idea of the way in which these elements break down and get lifted up into position. You can see, if you look closely, that they're relying on the scaffolding to lift things up from the ground. The whole of this edifice has been created by building the scaffolding first, carrying light things up to the top, and then pulling the heavy stuff up. And things like this balcony detail were designed from the outset to be easily manhandleable pieces that clip directly onto the scaffolding, and yet once they're there are completely transforming its appearance. And here, the meat and potatoes of any rock show. This is the PA, a little bit bigger than the one used in Woodstock. And you'll see, which is interesting because I'm going to show you another Rolling Stones show later on. This is the same PA as was used on the tour that was done last year, but the presentation of it visually is totally different. Here it's buried inside the scaffolding. This is a bit larger than your average domestic PA. It rates about 500,000 watts a side. And because it's so noisy, the artists themselves have to have their own private PA so that they can hear what they're doing. And one of the rituals in the afternoon, once the stage set is ready, usually at around 2 o'clock, is to run a sound check where the artists go on the stage and try out the microphones, make sure that their monitor speakers, which you see here in the shot on the left, are all functioning so they can hear themselves. And there's an engineer whose entire life is dedicated to making sure that they get through their monitor speakers what they want to hear. Alternating with the monitors along here, you can see firework tubes. And these are used to make sure the audience know that the show's begun. Always a problem. And from there on, this little set of slides just gives us a chance to look at the way in which this extremely rich in its textured qualities, this extremely rich set could be lit in different ways by the lights. The lights on it, which are placed all over the thing, are at this point all computer controlled in the sense that they point by remote control in different directions. They can be maneuvered from narrow spots to floods, and they can change their color. And all of this is pre-programmed, so essentially the color changes are taking place at the result of a man pressing a button and stepping through a series of cues. Also in this slide on the left you can see 2 video screens. This is primitive video technology in 1989. These are video projectors. In fact, on each screen there are 3 video projectors shining through collimating mirrors to get images which are as dim as the images you see here. Now this was thought to be radically bright then, and these are screens 8 meters wide and about 5 meters high. But compared to the brightness of the lights, very dim. Other things that were used to embellish the appearance of the set were large format slide projectors. Generically, they tend to be referred to as Pani projectors after Ludwig Pani, the man who made the first of them for Wagnerian opera houses in Germany. But there are many different types. They effectively operate with large, just to say about A4-sized glass slides, and have lamp houses of anything up to 10 kilowatts behind them. So, as you can see in the slide on the right, this is a projection onto black, and mainly black material that you're looking at there. Quite a bright picture on black. And the other main feature that follows all shows of this kind is the need to control all this equipment and put follow spots somewhere that allows the band to be picked up on stage all the time. And the traditional way of doing this is to build something rather like a siege tower out in the middle of the audience, and the man who comes up with a way of not doing this will be very popular with the people selling the tickets, because if you look at the slide on the left, you can see the vast swath of Los Angeles Olympic Stadium that is completely devoid of people because you can't put anyone there because they can't see anything. But this is the point from which the whole of the show is controlled. These, needless to say, are a pair of inflatable ladies. They're 15 meters high and they blew up in about 20 seconds. And there you see them in context, looking slightly strange on their large inflatable poofs. But they did provide an opportunity for Jagger to get out there and play with the feet and generally muck about with them, which he enjoyed. And then when the tour came to Europe, it came to Europe in 1990, which, for those of you familiar with recent British history, was the year of the Dangerous Dogs Act. Margaret Thatcher, having been bitten by Norman Tebbit or something, was determined to prevent Rottweilers and other beasts from being let loose. So we made a whole bunch of extra inflatables to decorate the set. And I think inflatables are the archetypical contribution of the sort of 60s architectural thought to this kind of show, because they rely completely on post-war technology for their materials, the kind of materials that were being described by people like Archigram in the 60s, which were being used in air-sea rescue and in safety clothing and things like that. And these materials effectively make these kinds of constructions possible. And the rule, which you will come to recognize with any rock show, is to end with a lot of fireworks. And so this show ended rather as it began. And we move on, because this is the second show from the early 90s, to look at U2, who of course have a very different agenda to the Rolling Stones. And the conversations about the sort of show that they wanted focused very much on this different agenda, which was to find ways of presenting textural and visual images on a huge scale to the audience. And although the show eventually became a video show, it started off very much as a discussion about conventional projection technology, large format movie projectors and still projectors. And these sketches, which were done in, I think, 91 or 92, were basically the start of a long conversation that looked at various ways of doing this kind of thing. It also looked at including the circus troupe Archaos during the day as some kind of diversion for the people stuck in the stadium. But slowly the thing focused down, as it inevitably had to, onto ways of presenting video, because Bono was really focused on the idea of instantaneous video response, the idea that he could pick up things in the city from the local satellite channels, from local cable channels during the day as soon as the show arrived, and actually put them on the video screens at night. And so this began to throw up the ideas of putting video screens all over the stage face, and in combination with that there also developed an idea, an intellectual conceit, I think would be the most accurate way of describing it, that the stage should not appear to be designed, which is harder than it looks when you're actually going to go and take all this stuff into a stadium. But this is really what we were trying to achieve in this thing. And so we stuck to really dealing with the functional issues of how to place these video screens so that they looked as if they had just accidentally turned up there, which is plainly not very sensible as an intellectual proposition, and tried to avoid constructing anything special to do it. And so this in its turn led to the rationale that the lighting fixtures out in the front, instead of being lighting fixtures, should be old trabants that would be turned into lighting fixtures. This was a conceit of Willie Williams, the lighting designer, which suffered rather badly when it turned out that trabants are so badly made that they don't make very good follow spots. And so we had in the end to make fiberglass replicas of the trabants to look like trabants, because real trabants are made by MFI out of a combination of mouse fur and sealing wax, and they disintegrate in the rain, which is a surprising property. What you see here is a front view and a cross-section of the stage, and the cross-section of the stage includes some optimistic features which were rapidly discarded by the band. A 24-meter downstage lighting tower, which survived about 3 shows at huge expense before it was deemed to be too expensive to erect, and a sliding roof ditto. It was thought much better to let the band get wet. But this show is a combination of the Egyptian scaffolding method, which you see here building the PA towers. And for the first time in shows which Jonathan and I did together, we went to a Belgian company which was starting, it had started 2 or 3 years before, to manufacture proprietary truss expressly to sell into the rock and roll rental market. And these trusses were used to frame the video screens. And it was a baptism of fire to try to do something with these trusses other than construct the roof that they would normally have been used to build. Because what we were trying to do here was build vertical, flat structures of towers with beams between them. And of course, this rather relies, as you can see in this slide on the right, on the tower being perpendicular so that the beam, which needless to say is not very elastic, will fit precisely between the 2 towers at heights of anything up to 18 meters off the ground. And this thing, which seemed so easy when we sat around over bottles of wine discussing how it was going to be done, became an absolute nightmare of 2 men at the end of each end of this 18-meter long piece of steel saying, "To me, no, to me." And of course, no one wants to get near it because have your fingers off in a second. And there were terrible days when putting this particular truss in would take anything up to 2 hours, whereas a man building a similar structure in scaffolding would have been off down the pub about half an hour after he started. So it had its learning curve doing this sort of thing. But the 24-meter radio mast was a triumph of economical packing, and it was also a triumph of getting it made very quickly. The thing sat around as a matter of debate between the band, the accountants, the designers, the lighting designer, and anyone else like the caterers, the hairdressers who happened to come into the tent, until about a week before the first show was due in New York. And then it was finally ordered, and the poor people in San Francisco threw the thing together in about 4 days, put it on a truck, sent it over to New York, where it promptly got lost, and the driver of the truck declared that he was unable to find Giant Stadium, which was something of a triumph for anyone who knows North America, but no doubt he kept his job. And it was very fine. It was, as I say, 24 meters high and so enormously strong that the inspecting engineer for Giant Stadium insisted that the PA tower be attached to it, lest the PA tower fall over. We should go back to that, because the final funny story about this this tower is that it was erected, as you can see, by a crane. And this did mean that there was a crane in the stadium, and indeed that the crane needed to be on the side of the stage that the tower was. And so when the happy-go-lucky crew responsible for this show eventually finished off the entire stage construction, including both of the PA wings, with the crane still on the field, before realizing that the exit tunnel for the crane was behind the stage, they got rather tired and emotional and looked for somebody to blame, and decided that the person who designed the tower to need a crane to put it up, who happened not to be there, was clearly the person best suited to take the can. And so at that point the tower was history and got cut up for scrap, which is some sort of a lesson about the way in which teamwork goes in rock and roll. This is a fiberglass imitation Trabant, and on the right 3 fiberglass imitation Trabant. And these are how you deploy fiberglass imitation Trabants, for those of you wishing to do this sort of thing in your schemes. Basically, you can do this very easily by renting the Grove lift from your local man lift company and designing your own private widget to go on the end to take the trabant. It's very straightforward. Here we see video screens, U2 in America, and this is just a detail of how this very primitive form of video display was organized. You see little huts built up in the scaffolding and conical socks of light excluding fabric leading to the screens, which are plainly on the front. And in each of these little huts there are 3 video projectors ganged up to shoot onto the screen. And they produce, as you will shortly see, the most unbelievably dim pictures. But this, I think, does provide some testament to our achievement in making the thing look like it was not designed at all. This was what the show looked like when the audience came in. It just looked like a totally random collection of junk. And once the show started, the video screens came on, and because they were so dim, it actually continued for a lot of the show to look like a random collection of junk as well. But occasionally it had its moments of glory, as in when Bono got up on one lot of video screens in silhouette. But it was some distance away from achieving what it really wanted to do, which was the huge impact that these video statements, these iconic words and phrases should have had as they got spread randomly over this thing in a great feast of video imagery. But there were moments when it was also very splendid, like when the cars went up on their lifts and when the short-lived radio mast did its stuff with its road lights up at the top. And the whole thing ended up looking, I think, very different to any other rock show that had been done at that point. And if you bear in mind that this is an object which has exactly the same design program and intention as the steel wheel set that you've just seen, I think you can reason that it's certainly showing that there is no relationship here between the form and the program. The trabant that's up on the little lamppost on the right is out in the middle of the house, and one of the delights of this show was having a small stage that the band processed out to that was right in the middle of the audience, and this trabant was spent a lot of the afternoon there with the DJ in it and then got lifted up to provide a sort of, it was a mirror ball trabant basically, it was covered in little squares of mirror, and it sort of sat there revolving quietly while the band and any guests that they managed to corral went out and strummed a little acoustic set out in the middle. And just a couple of closing slides of the big look of the whole thing. And now, if the gentleman on the projector could change the slides. The thing that unites these two schemes from the early 90s is that they both use scaffolding as the central core of the construction. But as you saw in the U2 set, there was appearing in the rock and roll marketplace proprietary truss systems, of which this particular one from Belgium was the one that I got rather involved with. And the next two stages are constructionally quite different to the first two. I'm going to show you a stage for Pink Floyd done in '94 and a stage for the Rolling Stones also done in '94 but touring on into '95. And both of these are taking, again in the same way as you could say that scaffolding is a generic product that gets crafted into different constructions like the U2 set or the steel wheel set. This is taking a proprietary truss system and crafting it into different constructions. And in the Floyd stage set in particular, this arch that forms the basis of the design, the band's requirement was very simple. They, as many of you will know, they do this kind of spacey, trippy music, is I suppose the way they would see it. And what they wanted to do was to create a portal at the end of a stadium that would be, as it were, a gateway to another world, of space in which they could create literal imagery of other worlds. And so we eventually focused on the idea that an arch would be the simplest, strongest form to deliver this. And after a bit of contemplation of tea leaves, I decided that the right arch would be about 40 meters in diameter, which is fairly big. And of course the immediate snag was that there was no one offering such an arch for hire, much less anybody who had one that you could put up in a day. And so Neil Thomas, the engineer at Atelier 1, and myself were faced with the rather interesting challenge of getting this together, having promised it to the band. This is always the best way to do things. Promise something to somebody who will give you lots of money and then go off and figure out how to do it, rather, as it were, than expressing any doubt in the meeting. Always a bad idea to express doubt. And what we sold them on was the idea that we would build this arch, nice simple shape, and we would give them a circular screen. The Floyd have always had a circular screen. A small circular screen, 15 or so meters in diameter, and that this screen would hide out of sight behind the stage and then appear magically like a rising moon, allow them to put pictures on it, and towards the end of the show it would go horizontal and descend over the band, illuminating them in a magic flying saucer appearance of triumph, blah, blah, blah. You can imagine all that kind of stuff. But, of course, that's the easy bit. So we went along to Stageco and we said, look, we've got this sort of a problem. We want to build this arch. Now, everything you see in this picture, essentially, is what you saw in the Tina Turner proscenium stage way back at the beginning, which you will notice was a rather rectilinear structure. So what we basically did was take a regular flat roof and put a bunch of little tie bars in it to spring it into an arch. And then, because arches of that sort of size and profile have a tendency to hop about in the wind, we got a large number of tanks and put them down at the bottom and fill them up with water. Stop it blowing away. And the manner in which this thing got itself built is quite clever. This was the major innovation of the Belgian company. Essentially, the thing is made as a series of rectangular pieces which are built on the flat stage. A key piece of this construction, and you'll see it also in the stones set next, is building this meter-high deck which you can roll things on the ground before you start doing anything else. This is a very quick thing to build. You can get a bunch of people in there and build a thing like that in 4 hours. And then you can start assembling the truss on top of it as a series of rectangles, and you start at one end with your cranes and lift the first piece onto the water ballasted props and then hinge the next piece to it, and you work your way across the arch, hinging your way up until you eventually have the whole thing complete. This avoids you having to have the big moment where you lift the entire arch up into the air from the middle. Needless to say, if you tried to do that, it would fold up in the middle and collapse, being an arch. But then, because of the fact that this thing leans forward an enormous amount, it then got this little arch put in at the back and a series of tension ties, essentially these trusses, which stop the thing falling over forwards. And the reason that this arch is there is because the circular screen that is going to get lifted up inside it is so big that it sticks out the back of this structure. This is because space in front of the stage is money, and so there's a sort of unwritten but pretty well stuck to dimension for how far your barricade can be from the back of any stadium. And we were right up against it with this thing, and so the circular screen had to poke out the back. We then set about making this concave projection screen which fills in the back of the arch. And this is a very large sheet of fabric. It's exciting trying to put sheets of fabric as large as this up in the wind, but you can do it. And the fabric itself is stretched into shape. You can see the slide on the right has these rather strange grey tubes attached to the back of the fabric. These are air tubes which will eventually be filled with compressed air. And they're sort of magic tubes in the sense that the higher the air pressure in them, the more they go into a banana shape. And in this way, they force the fabric into the negative curvature, which is effectively a section of the surface of a sphere. The unexpected property of these tubes, which is why they're not widely employed in industry, is that they randomly explode and fail. This was not pointed out to us by the man who sold them. Also up there on the back, you can see the projection booth. In there is a 70mm cinema projector with a 10K lamp house, which is used to project onto the back of the circular screen. Once the arch was up, putting the arch up, by the time people got reasonably practiced at it, took about 8 hours. And then the production, and by the time we're now in 94, we're working on shows which don't have the luxury, as the Stones did in 89, of having 2 productions. This show had 1 production, which would come in usually the afternoon before the show, meaning that if you were doing a show on a Wednesday, this would be arriving at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the previous day from the show that it had just done. So you might imagine that if you'd done a show in Dallas on the Monday evening, then the stuff would be arriving in Miami or Atlanta on the Tuesday afternoon, and you'd be doing your next show on the Wednesday night. And you'd then take it down and be doing another show somewhere else on the Friday night, and probably doing 2 nights in that city, thus getting you up to your magic 4 shows a week. The lighting truss, this big arched lighting truss at the back, you can see quite an ingenious packing system there. It's a triangular truss, and it's curved, which would be an absolute pig to put in a truck. And so I made the thing L-shaped and took the bracing bars in one side out completely for transport, so the thing stacks. The stage that the band played on gets constructed on this so-called substage. So we're looking down here at a substage, the 1 metre high platform built right across the field. And then this little world, which the band inhabit, gets built on the top. And it has a sort of underworld where they keep guitars and tune-up equipment and bits and pieces and little stairs that come up. It also has a roof on the top of it, because the real roof of the arch, being 20 metres above it, is jolly interesting but not much use for keeping the rain off. And here are a couple of shots of the thing being put up at night, and you can see the circular screen lying on the floor of the stage there, and you can see the gateway that was built into the lighting around the perimeter of the arch at the bottom. That gate swung open to allow the circular screen to take off and go up. In the slide on the right, you can see the mix position that was used for the Floyd, and this mix position incorporated a little effect of its own, a large mirror ball, which appeared out of the back of the mix position. The roof slid back, and this mirror ball grew up from it on a proprietary magic tower. It's a wonderful tower called Starlift, which made by a company called Tomcat. And essentially it takes the form of a triangular truss which rolls up on 3 bales at the bottom and unrolls under power and grows, in the case of this particular one, to a height of 18 metres, lifting, as it did, the mirror ball, which itself weighed 4 tons. Here you see a collection of stout Texans wheeling the hub of the mirror ball, get that, down the tunnel into the stadium. This is just the hub, and here the mirror ball being put together with these quite large petals. And you can see in the slide on the right the Starlift coming up through the floor decking of the mix position. So, a Floyd show, of course, is, I think, popularly billed as a multimedia extravaganza. What this means is that they make a lot of noise and flash the lights on and off. And the thing started with some quite nice retro oil and water effects on the screen at the back, and then went on to large-scale projector effects. These projections are being done from a projector deck out in the mixed position at the front. So if we kick back to here, you can see the very top floor of the projection level of the mixed position poking out above everything else. You can also see, if you look at the face of the stage at the bottom of the arch, this ring of black surface, which looks black. It is black. These are machines. They're effectively periactoid machines, which are the triangular advertising devices that you see that rotate, except that in this case, on one side they had black, which you just saw in the previous slide. On another face, they had rows of light bulbs, each light bulb individually programmable, and on the third face they had mirror. And these lights allowed us to do big Telecaster effects across the front. And the actual little vinyl canopy that goes over the band was also a major sort of lighting feature in the set. And here you see all of these are front projection effects, and including Telecaster type writing effects on the periactoid. And then these are laser effects, a big laser installation on each side of the stage. And then this is the ascent of the circular screen. This is a 15-meter diameter circular screen with computer-controlled lights all around its circumference. And when it gets into position, it's lined up with the projection booth that you saw hung off the back of the structure, allowing 70mm projection onto it. And there you see immediately, if you think back to those dreadfully optimistic U2 pictures, the difference between cinema brightness with a really powerful cinema projector and the sort of video non-brightness, which still this day is a problem with video projection. But in the interim period, there have been other video technologies emerge which give you brighter pictures, which we'll see on the Rolling Stones. And then, of course, we have pigs. And the pigs in this particular case popped out of the PA towers, did their thing, and then fell out and marked the end of the first half by plunging to the ground as the lights went out. And then in the second half, why are those two slides the same? That's not a lot of fun, is it? Oh, they're opening. This is the... Silly me. I haven't done this lecture for a year. This is the mirror ball at its full height, and once it had got up to its full height, the petals broke open, and the thing itself had a 14 kilowatt xenon source in the center. So once it was there, the trick with this, as it slowly emerged, it took us a long time to get there, but what we did was to do this thing with the flying saucer circular screen. So everyone was looking at the circular screen, seeing if we were going to drop it. And while they did that, we cranked the mirror ball up behind, because it took about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes to get the damn thing up. And then at the right moment in Gilmore's solo, it would be hit by the follow spots, and everybody would look round and go, "Core fuck, God has arrived," and all that. And pull another deep toke on their joints, at which point the thing burst open, proving, if proof were needed, that God had definitely arrived at that point. And then while they were looking at that, we got the screen back into a vertical position and blew it up, proving that it's a very good way to end a show. So that was the Floyd, and that gave me a sort of level of confidence when I sat down with the Stones again, who were after some sort of extremely different looking stage set. They were a sort of double challenge, because they didn't want it just to be different to everybody else. They wanted it to be very different to what they'd done in '89. So I went to a number of meetings where I just doodled in sketchbooks and drew things which I had no clue at all how to build, until we finally got to a point where we had some sort of a storyline. And the story was that we were going to build this very modern gigabyte city. This is the city of the, God, this sounds dated, it's only 2 years ago. This is the city of the internet, the information culture, the modern, clean, hard, blah, blah, blah. And it was then going to transform to get that warm and fuzzy feeling into voodoo stuff partway through. This being based on a judgment no more complex than you couldn't flog that to people for 2 hours without them getting bored. And so we came up with this very cool, hard, internet, blah, blah, blah thingy, which is the model you see on the right. And then we proposed various versions of the kind of suburban, supernatural voodoo shrine around the fireplace to be made, needless to say, out of inflatables. So on the left you have an early collage of this, and on the right this is the maquette of the final thing, and you can see a Krishna, a nice Baron Samedi, a Madonna, child with one arm. And the most fabulous thing of all, I finally managed to sell somebody on building an inflatable Elvis Presley, so very important feature. But the main structural piece of heroics, again, tip of the fall up to Neil Thomas at Atelier 1, was this bizarre cantilevered lighting object, which became known as the Cobra, which is about 24, 25 meters high and reaches forward an astonishingly long way and is prevented from falling over by a large collection of Pink Floyd water tanks which sit down at the bottom of it. And up to the point where the knee breaks in the slide on the left, this is all rented structure, and then it goes into a series of custom-built truss frames which go on up to the top. Pretty well everything else in the primary structure of this stage set is rented with applied decoration. And here, for those of you thinking of getting a job as a lighting roadie, is a good image of the sort of day-to-day chores involved in this arduous duty. The lights on the head of the Cobra were, needless to say, applied at ground level and then had to be guided all the way up to the top of the Cobra, which was done by a man called Wayne most days, who then, needless to say, was faced with two choices. Either he could sit there until the show was over, or he had to come down, which involved climbing down the inside of the Cobra, which was quite an experience in its own right. And being a Cobra, this object that got lifted up to the top has on it, which you see the man fiddling with on the right here, a device for expelling propane at high pressure and igniting it, producing a large flame. And so that's the flame-throwing device there. You can also see in the slide on the left the substage type of construction which was adopted here in the same way as it had been used on the Floyd, which is basically being covered with all of the boxes of kit that are the production coming in. The basic principle here, the same as on the Floyd, that there were two primary structures, two Cobras that travelled, but only one set of cladding essentially. And here you see men, here you see carts of cladding on the stage, and here you see men putting the cladding onto the Cobra, probably on the morning of the show, because that would be the sort of timing in which this would be done, and it would explain why it's daylight. And here you see, as I mentioned earlier, the same PA system as had earlier featured in '89, and it's quite nice to look at the way that this PA system, which is expressly designed for touring, has been developed to achieve very rapid erection. The curved truss on the right, which is suspended from a series of chain hoists, picks up essentially the first line of cabinets, and then it gets lifted up 5 or 6 feet, and the next line of cabinets is run in underneath and pinned to it, and in this manner the thing is slowly lifted up. The rear wall of this thing, this was a development of the periactoy lighting effect on the Floyd, in that this rear wall has a light bulb at every node, and the design of the thing was such that the vertical chains of the structure could all be folded up and only the horizontal bars had to be put in at each assembly. It was a charming insight, considering the amount of effort that Jonathan went to work this out, that they then decided it was much quicker to just take the whole thing apart and put it together each time. It's the sort of exasperating way in which no matter how hard you try as a designer, you can never second guess the people who are really travelling and working with something on a daily basis, because anything that you think will be easy to do turns out to be difficult, and things that you imagine would be astonishingly difficult to do get done in no time at all. At the end of doing this series of shows, I ended up convinced that if we designed the thing in situ concrete, it would probably have been toured at the same sort of speed and possibly at lower cost than this thing. But here you see the custom-built stage that the band actually perform on going into place on top of the substage. It's a very lightweight structure, goes together very quickly. The people on the right are assembling in the centre of Mick Jagger's private dance floor the little trapdoor that he pops out of like a jackrabbit at one point in the show. And here men are assembling a spiral staircase, which again has to go together very quickly, and basically they start at the bottom and put the treads on and climb up. And a few other general views of the bits and pieces. You'll notice that there's a sort of vague amount of lip service played to things folding up neatly, but the reality of a show like this is that there's so much stuff that even if an object is extremely awkward in its shape, it can usually find a home in one of the trucks somewhere. So although some of the things get a fair amount of thought about how they can be made to nest and fold up, the reality is that a lot of it gets no thought at all and is none the worse for it. But this is the finished hard look of the set by daylight, and you can see a number of inflatable elements, particularly the things apparently holding up the PA on the left, that were put in there to add form to the thing. You can also see these long cantilevering bridges which spring out to right and left. These are 18 metres long, and they make a span of about 9 metres and then a cantilever of about 5 metres from their little supporting legs of scaffolding. And the strength of those things is entirely in the handrail. And the handrail, the whole truss of those bridges breaks down into 3-metre lengths. And one of the most surprising things was that we drew the thing out in the office in AutoCAD and sent the file as by this time in our office we had long abandoned doing drawings of this kind of thing if we could avoid it. We just sent computer files to people, and the man who built it, having a CNC machine, simply routed the shape of these trusses out at full size in plywood and laid them out on the workshop floor and welded the handrail together. So most interestingly, at an intellectual level of producing things like this, those very elegant bridges never got drawn at all on paper, except in views to show people, but the actual production of them was almost as automated as you could get. And a couple of photographs showing that again on this show we used the flamethrower at the top of the Cobra to get people to look round this time. And then here for the first time in these shows you see a really bright video screen. This is a Jumbotron, Sony Jumbotron screen. It's pretty large. It's about 12 metres wide by 7 metres high, and you can see that it's having absolutely no difficulty in delivering an image as bright as the lights. It can deliver a perfectly satisfactory image with sunshine falling onto it in broad daylight. And it's this sort of screen that I'm sure most of you imagine when you draw video screens on the fronts of your buildings. The only snag, one would have to say, apart from the huge amount of power they consume, is that the retail price for a screen of that size is about $3 million. But here we see various effects using the lighting matrix on the back wall. And here effects from the computer-controlled lights surrounding the screen and mounted in the underside of the Cobra. And just visible on the right, but it does give you an idea of the size of the screen and the general staging of this thing. You can see Jagger up on the catwalk in front of the screen, and his enlargement on the screen dancing with the animated video behind him. And then, as I said, partway through the show, it turned very quickly, although not as fast as the inflation of the dolls in steel wheels. These things took about 25 seconds to get inflated, but it was a pretty complicated and awkward affair to do. But when they finally appeared, these inflatables completely transformed the appearance of the stage and made the thing reasonably strange. And pretty nice voodoo shrine, suburban voodoo shrine for a few moments. Of course, in America, this sort of show gets done quite regularly indoors, indoors being a relative term when you're looking at things the size of Wembley Stadium that are covered. And surprisingly, in spaces as big as this, one can actually go ahead and do most of the pyro, because the roof is so far above you that it's not much of an issue. Which brings me to the last two slides. As it were, confirming the rule that the way to end any good rock show, and probably the way to end a lecture, is by having some fireworks. Thank you very much. I'd like to run fairly soon. I think we should do that.
It's traditional to ask for questions, bearing in mind that Margaret Atwood, Canadian novelist's favourite question at this time was, where did you get your hair done? So perhaps questions on the how do you do it line rather than why. It's all too obvious. Why?
No one wants to ask how you do it.
No.
No. It's all, that's far too obvious.
That's right. Yeah. There's one.
Why are inflatables the exception to the structural rule instead of the rule? Couldn't you make the structure of an inflatable?
I doubt it.
Adding them on?
Well, it would be much more expensive than renting your structure ready-made. That's not an exception to the rule. The basic rule of all of this stuff is it's done as cheaply as possible. This may seem a surprising observation, but it is provable. I mean, given that you are going to do it at all, which is plainly both unnecessary and more expensive than not doing it, you then do it as cheaply as you can.
You're exploding bananas.
Yes, well, it would be, certainly the man who sold them to us said they were. That's true. It's not a view that I hold any longer, I have to say, having used them. They're sort of, they look structural, as do many things until you try. No, you're dealing with pretty large loads. The things like the Floyd Arch were carrying superimposed loads of about 28 tons. So it was a pretty lightweight structure, even though it was built of steel. Ditto the Cobra. I mean, the thing about something like the Cobra is it's a totally arbitrary shape. But given that you've drawn it and someone's saying, okay, go build it, what do you do? The history of the Cobra was in fact quite interesting insofar as by the time they said go build it, well, they need to start this story by the rehearsal day. The first show for the Voodoo Lounge was the 1st of August of 90, whatever year we're talking about, 94. And we got a go-ahead to build the stage set on the 1st of June. And at that point there had been nothing done apart from a nice cardboard model and a bunch of presentation things. So at that point you're not exactly going to fuck about and wonder about the most elegant way of doing it. You're down your local steel merchant asking him what he's got on the rack and whether it can be corralled into making this kind of a shape. And a lot of that sort of decision goes on for the custom built stuff. The rest of it is off the shelf, so you're using materials that already exist and will go back into somebody's yard at the end of the show. That's why, and it's philosophically it's very interesting this, because coming as I did into rock and roll from the world of architecture and Archigram and carefully designed solutions, and seeing this sort of thing still going on in the imagery of future systems, to take one particularly favourite example of mine, I'm interested in how the reality of touring the instant city, which is so founded in the economics of its construction, of its sourcing of materials, of its truckability and so forth, comes down to things that don't have any of the visual language which we as architects associate with lightweight, instantly put up things. And that is the most interesting outcome of having worked in this business for 10 years doing these things. I mean, partly it's sprung from the fact that the people who are the clients aren't interested in that look anyway, but even on something like Voodoo Lounge, where you could make some sort of intellectual argument for attaching its styling to a sort of future systems, let's have a space satellite with funny legs approach, there's no way that you could sustain it economically. And there's absolutely no way that you need to. The cheapest way of doing anything still, if you want it done in a hurry, is to go down the labour exchange and rent 100 people. And there is no escaping that truth. It's much cheaper than designing something that will deploy itself automatically when you press a button. And that's what really guides all of this all the time.
You've got some amazing things going on here. You've got the fireworks, you've got the structure being built in incredible speed with labour that's probably never worked together before. What about the whole issue of safety? I mean, how do you actually control that? Because before that thing can take place as an event, you've obviously got to satisfy yourself that it is safe to allow that number of people in and around it.
Yes, I suppose you should. Well, part of the answer to that, it's one of the delights of the business is that the crew that erect these things divide into two groups, the people who tour with it all the time and the local labour they pick up. And typically on something like the Voodoo Lounge, you'll have a crew of about 200 people on the road who are the foreman in charge of the construction or operation of the show. And then you will have nearly as many people hired locally to load and unload the trucks and do whatever construction is necessary. There is a huge pressure in the business to reduce the number of people all the way along, and that is far fewer than the number of people who were involved in erecting steel wheels 6 years before, where the numbers were closer to 400. But even within that, the 200 people, by the time the show's been on the road for a little while, first of all, most of these people, and the other people who work in the business like myself, we all know each other because they just do it again and again. We've all been doing it for so long. But the other thing is that by the time we are 2 or 3 weeks into rehearsals, these people know their bit of the stage set off by heart. There are no drawings. These things are not put up from drawings. They're put up from habit, basically. The process of its construction is learned over the first few weeks of the tour, and then at that point the designers like myself leave it and they go off and do it. And so two things are going on. First of all, they're building it from memory, which means you get the steady evolution of its construction to be faster and more efficient. But also, because these people are also inhabiting it and using it, they are your quality control. They're not people who are going to construct the Cobra in a way which leaves a few bolts out and then climb up it. This would be very negatively indicated, and they would never do it. And they become very tightly identified with the thing that they're doing, and so that becomes its quality control. When things like this go into countries which have highly organised building control, like Germany or certain states in the United States, like Ontario or New York or California, there's never any problem when building inspectors come around. They get shown around by the crew, and drawings are produced, and it is demonstrated that the thing is constructed in accordance with the drawings. But that's if anyone can find the drawings at that point. But usually they ring up. It's a famous thing with Neil's office that he can usually tell where the stage is about to go that there happens to be a building inspector, because they'll ring him up and ask for a set of the drawings to be sent because they've lost them. But at that point, they then go through all the calcs and everything. So it's very circus-like in that way, and of course quite different to the adversarial nature of conventional construction. And I think that's the key to it. The people who are putting this thing up are a team, and they're totally involved in what they're doing. They don't have any interest in it going wrong. Put it another way, they're not going to make any more money if it goes wrong. Probably get paid more if it goes right. So this helps.
Does it happen that something is built somewhere completely different than you intended because they just got what they did? I don't want to say that the Cobra is suddenly the other way around.
No, it's more subtle than that. Basically, they leave things out. And then when you ask where they were, they say that they forgot to put them on the truck 2 or 3 cities ago. And these are usually things which have come to be identified as unnecessary. It's a sort of experimental process. They leave them out and they see if any of the artists complain. And if they don't, then they don't come back. You know, well, Mick didn't miss it, so who are you to care? Is the way in which it works. And then, of course, there are appallingly embarrassing stories of things which get built and don't work. But that's another evening, I think.
What's next?
A drink, I think.
2 rolls.
2 rolls?
2 rolls, yes, 2 rolls. 2 rules, that's what I was trying to say. 2 rolls in show business.
What's that?
Leave them wanting more. And second, to avoid a stampede, you say Elvis has left the building. In this case, Mark Fisher's left the building.
Going.
Yeah, we're going.
Good.
Good.
Thank you very much.